Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So, I just watched Gladiator 2. Let's talk about it. So Gladiator 2 is the legacy sequel to 2000's Gladiator, which ended up winning the award for Best Picture at the Oscars. So this movie is clearly a very big deal, and I actually only watched it a few years ago for the very first time, and I was blown away by how much I ended up enjoying it. I talk about this in my tier list video where I ranked the Best Picture winners over the last 30 years or so you can go ahead and check that out if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that. But when it comes to the release of this movie, initially when I heard there was going to be a sequel, I wasn't too excited because we've gotten a wave of legacy sequels from Hollywood in recent years, and for the most part they've been met with mixed to negative reviews, as most sequels are. It's tough for there to be a really strong sequel in general, let alone when you're dealing with a film that initially came out decades before. But Ridley Scott, okay, the world's most prolific Hollywood director, Ridley Scott, at his big old age, decided to give it a go with one of his prized possessions in his filmography. And the results were surprising. The results were very surprising. And I'm going to be diving into my thoughts on this one in this review. So if that sounds fun to you guys, keep watching. But of course, before we get into all that good stuff, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now without further ado, guys, let's sink into this. So the story of Gladiator 2 takes place 16 years after the events of the first Gladiator movie, which was a hell of a film, okay? And that movie saw the death of the protagonist, portrayed by Russell Crowe, called Maximus Aurelius Marcus Sanctimus, all of these ancient Roman names, okay? But he was one of the most iconic characters of the early 2000s, so nothing but respect for Maximus, okay? But he met a tragic end in the Colosseum at the end of the first film, and in the second film we follow his son instead, who's now portrayed by Hollywood hot boy of the decade, Paul Mescal. Now at the beginning of the film, Paul Mescal is essentially like a sergeant. He's not a captain, or he's not a general, maybe he's a captain, I don't know, but he is in a position of some authority in an army in North Africa, and how he got there is a bit of a mystery, but when we first meet him, he's actually with his wife, who is an archer, and she's also in the army, and they're trying to defend themselves and their territory against the evil Romans who continue to expand their greedy little empire. But unfortunately, despite their best efforts, Hanno, who Paul Mescal's character is known as at this point, and his wife and their army are no match for Pedro Pascal's Marcus Acacius, the Roman general that's been sent to take over this region of northern Africa. He's clearly very experienced in the art of colonialism, and so this is just yet another triumph for him in a long run of triumphs. And at the very beginning, you can see that his heart is not wholly into it, because he has lost perhaps, faith and trust and interest in pursuing the wants and desires of the greedy twin emperors over in Rome. So he is world weary and internally defeated, but externally he is still the general that he is known to be, extremely powerful, extremely efficient, down on the ground with his men, and he gets the job done. And so we see him setting alight to hundreds of bodies of the fallen as he claims yet another victory in the name of the Roman Empire. So whilst Acacius ends up returning back home to Rome with the emperors pledging a whole parade and games in the Colosseum in his honor, on the flip side you have Hanno, who is now a prisoner of war, and he ends up a slave in the hands of a former slave himself, Macronus, who's portrayed by none other than Denzel Washington. Oh, wake it up, guys, wake it up. Denzel Washington is in this movie. We will discuss further. Macronus has Hanno and his cohorts fighting in a ring to test out their skills and see how well they could do as gladiators in the ultimate ring, which is the Colosseum. And he spots something interesting in Hanno very early on. And it's not just because he's the protagonist, although it's mostly because he's the protagonist, but it's also because of the rage, the anger that he feels towards the Roman Empire, and in particular towards Acacius, the general who caused the death of his wife. So yeah, we have yet another death of the wife situation being a main motivator for the male protagonist. I've talked about my dislike of this trope on various occasions on this channel, and like, I still don't like it. I still do not like, you know, the idea of fridging a female character for the sake of motivating the male protagonist. Like, nah. And even though Hollywood tried to spice it up a little bit and be like, look, we're progressive, we're making her an archer before she dies, I still see right through them. I still see right through them because it's the same old trope that we've been seeing for literally decades now, and we need to put it to bed. We need to put it to rest because it's a really lazy way of having a female character be in a male protagonist's life. Anywho, Hanno is motivated by this anger towards Cassius and the Roman Empire. Not to mention, he is an experienced fighter and veteran, and so he is able to impress Denzel Washington with his performance in the ring, and he's able to rise up the ranks pretty quickly, and he soon finds himself in front of the emperors, where he is able to display his prowess as a one-to-one combatant. Now, the emperors themselves are Emperor Geta and Caracalla, who are portrayed by Joseph Quinn and Fred, is it Hechinger or Hetchinger? I don't know, sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, respectively, and they are very disliked and very unpopular amongst the Romans, because even though they keep trying to, you know, expand the empire beyond its already impressive borders all the way to India and, you know, the New World, although it's not known as such at this point, they're not able to feed any of their people, and the Roman dream that was dreamt up by Marcus Aurelius is well and truly dead at this point. And so the people hate them, and they try to distract the people with these celebrations about these empty victories, and they try to hide behind the popularity and success of the general in order to sedate the people, basically, and satiate them just enough to prevent a rebellion that would lead to their demise. So they're super excited then to be introduced to Hanno, this brand new gladiator that can be a new showstopper for their games that are now being held in honor of Acacius's victory in North Africa. So then you get these various action sequences taking place in the Colosseum, the world famous stage, where you have various fights against animals, against the elements, like literal water. Literal water comes into play here. You have all of these creative fights that are taking place that the gladiators have to survive through, all for the entertainment of the Roman elite and the greedy, evil emperors. Now, ultimately, there are various political moves and machinations taking place behind the scenes, with different characters having different motives. Some want to dethrone the greedy little emperors and get rid of them to restore the Roman dream. That's the case for Connie Nielsen's character. And also, it turns out that her husband Acacius is working alongside her to do this. But then others are trying to elevate their own social standing and get into positions of power, perhaps so they could topple the Roman Empire themselves, or so they can, you know, remake it and shape it in their own image. And that's very much the case for Denzel Washington's character. And then somewhere in between, you have Hanno, who it turns out is Lucius, is none other than Lucius, the little kid that we saw in the first Gladiator movie, who was Connie Nielsen and Russell Crow's son. Yes, he is the son of Maximus. He is the son of Maximus, which will come to very few people's surprise considering this is a legacy sequel, right? So he kind of has to figure all of that out because technically speaking, he's also the heir to the Roman throne, if you could even call it that. That's not quite how it worked all the time historically, but anywho, because his grandfather was, of course, Marcus Aurelius, the original dreamer himself. So there's a lot going on, okay, in the story. There are twists and turns, betrayals, murders, and spectacular action sequences. A lot to behold, but we'll get into my thoughts at this point because otherwise I'm just retelling what happened. So I already said I was a huge fan of the original Gladiator movie. It's just a classic film, like with a capital F. Like it has kind of that grand nature, that cinematic quality. It has that texture, it has that vibe that we very rarely see in modern filmmaking nowadays. And it's not just because it was literally filmed on film rather than digital. It's also because of the grandness and the scale of the original film and that feeling that you're being incepted into the Roman Empire at its peak and you're experiencing all of the scenes and smells and laughter and anger that's surrounding the characters. Like it's very immersive in that way, whereas nowadays in the films that we've been seeing, the worlds haven't felt quite as immersive. The sets have felt like sets, and that's something that I have talked about quite a bit in various reviews. So that wasn't really an issue with the original Gladiator movie, and I'm happy to report that it's not an issue with this one either. The film is good. The film is good. I think it takes some of the best qualities of the original Gladiator movie and kind of amps it up just a little bit and makes it more 2024 appropriate. And so for the most part, I think this was a very successful sequel. I will say I saw this movie on Saturday. It came out a whole week before in the UK, which is very unusual these days, unfortunately. But not only did I see this a week before you guys will, but I also saw this in IMAX. And so coming out of the cinema, I was like hands on head, knees on the floor, like this is the best thing. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I was pumped. Ooh, I was pumped. I was like, yes, let's go. Not to mention this year has been, and I've been talking about this, I've been saying this, that this year has been so disappointing when it comes to a lot of the media that we have gotten out of Hollywood. And so I was really excited to just see something grand and spectacular and crazy and wild. And this just ticked all of the boxes. At least that's what I thought coming out of the cinema on Saturday. And now it's a few days after. And I've had some time to think, but I've also had some time to watch the original Gladiator movie, and my thoughts are a little bit more tempered. But let's start off with the good first of all. Story-wise, I thought it was strong. Like, I was intrigued by all of the different characters. I appreciated how everyone had their own different motives, their own kind of maneuvers that they were trying to do in order to further their own interests. Having all of these characters that were relatively complex kept it interesting. It didn't feel like we were dragging when we were doing some of that character work, which was good. And it certainly helped that each and every one of the actors gave phenomenal performances. But some standouts though were definitely Joseph Quinn. Joseph Quinn is another new white boy on the block who's seen quite a bit of success and popularity in this decade. He's part of the same kind of oeuvre and a generation as Paul Mescal, these kind of white boys who make it big on a streaming show that's highly regarded. In the case of Paul Mescal, it was Normal People from BBC, and Joseph Quinn was, of course, in Stranger Things over at Netflix, and they managed to rise up the ranks, you know, acting alongside Academy Award winning actresses like Lupita Nyong'o. They've seen huge amounts of success, which I obviously am side-eyeing, but I will say that Joseph Quinn on this occasion absolutely knocked it out of the park in his performance as Emperor Geta, as did Fred Hetchinger? I don't know how to pronounce his name, I'm so sorry. sorry, who was the younger brother, who was brattier, who was stupider, and who was easier to manipulate, which is why he was the one who ended up living slightly longer than his twin did. We also got a great performance out of Pedro Pascal, who looked like he belonged. Pedro Pascal, I know much has been said about Paul Mescal's nose and his whole appearance feeling very Roman. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's just stop by Pedro Pascal for a second here, because he looked immaculate. He looked immaculate as a Cassius. Like, he looked like he belonged, actually. He looked like he could be a revived version of one of the very real Roman statues in the British Museum. Because he looked like he belonged in that era. Like, it was just seamless. Like, I didn't question it. I was like, oh yeah, Pedro Pascal is a Roman general for sure. And then we move on to the other new boy on the block, and that is Paul Mescal. Paul Mescal. Now, Paul Mescal is an interesting one to me, because whilst everyone and their mama is obsessed with this guy and thinks he's so hot, so attractive, gagging over him, I'm over here like I'm just not seeing it. I'm just not seeing it. Visually, he's just not pretty enough for my taste, but that's besides the point. I do agree that he was perfectly cast for this film, because he does look like he could feasibly be an ancient Roman man. So that's all well and good. But aside from the aesthetics, aside from his looks, because let's not be too mean now, in terms of his acting, I have seen quite a bit from him at this point. I did watch Normal People, After Sun, and All of Us Strangers, and I thought he was really great. He's great at playing these more like quiet characters, a bit more reserved, a bit more quirky, personable, relatable, down to earth sort of thing. Like, he's good at that type of character. But like, I'm not gagged by him. Like, I'm not gagged the way that y'all are. So that's my position when it comes to Paul Mescal. And when it comes to him being the main protagonist of this legacy sequel and trying to wear the shoes, trying to wear the shoes that Russell Crowe filled in 2000, that is a very, very tall order, and I didn't have the highest hopes, considering how I feel like he's overrated, like as I just said. But I have to hold my hands. I think he made a decent effort. I think he made a jolly good effort of it. I thought he gave a fantastic performance in this film. Like I said, he's very good in those quieter, more emotional beats, more contemplative elements to the character. He's always going to be really good at that stuff. But he was also able to deliver on the action front, because this is like the biggest action movie that he's been in, or starred in at least. And I think he was really convincing as this, powerful, angry, furious gladiator who wants answers for all that's been done to him. So props to Paul Mescal. He delivered on all fronts, but let's be realistic here. He wasn't quite Russell Crowe. Like, we're not saying he's on the level of Maximus. Sorry, Lucius, but you're not your daddy, okay? But still, he did a fantastic job. He was given quite a complex, interesting character for us to follow, and I think he did a really good job with the material. But now let's get into the main event. Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington being in this Gladiator sequel absolutely made all the difference. All of the difference. Every single time I saw Denzel on the screen, I said, let me just soak this in. This is a feast for the eyes. This is a delight. This is a treasure, actually. I thought he was the best part of this film. He's so charismatic, and most importantly, he's so at ease with the script that it feels like he's just organic. Like, he feels real. Every word that's coming out of his mouth feels like it's just his own thoughts. He has this quality that comes with being one of the greatest actors working today, where he's able to make his lines sound and feel so organic and feel so true to the character, and like they are really being said for the first time ever. It does not feel scripted at all. It feels like Denzel is just talking to his mates, you know, to his fellow citizens, Roman citizens. It's just extraordinary, honestly. Like, and this might be a hot take here, you know, breaking news here on this channel, but this new kid, Denzel Washington, yeah, he might he might have something here. In terms of the story that his character was given, once again, it was super compelling. I mean, there weren't any major surprises here. It's a classic case of, you know, someone who has come from hardship, trying to wrangle their way to the top, doing whatever it takes, whatever is necessary to get there. And then he makes the ultimate moves. Like, he doesn't mess around, especially in the second half of the film, where he gets rid of the emperors who stand in his way of ultimate power and dominion over the Roman Empire. So I actually appreciated him as a potential emperor for the empire. He was far more qualified than those he was far more qualified than them. And actually, if we're keeping it a buck, if we're keeping it real, he was also more qualified than Paul Mescal. Like, he was more qualified than Lucius. Lucius has a claim because of his bloodline and blah blah blah, but like, I feel like, considering all that Rome is going through right now, it could use a meritocracy. Like, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this theocracy. Let's get rid of this royal family bloodline, and let's introduce some meritocracy and see what gives there. Because I actually like the sound of Denzel's ideas. Like, he was talking about freeing Rome. He was talking about destroying the empire, decolonizing. Like, that actually sounded good to me. As I didn't really get much of an idea of Lucius's policies when he becomes the leader of Rome. You know, he's holding on to his grandfather's dream, but as Denzel pointed out, his grandfather himself was also a colonizer, and his brand is still on his chest. So, like, I think we needed to hear out Denzel. I actually think ultimately the wrong person won. And another great aspect of this film was its cinematic quality. It felt grand. It felt worthy of the biggest screen. It had great sets, great production design, great use of CG. I mean, we got these like wild animals, like these baboons in the first scene that we saw with Hanno fighting in the smaller pit, and that was very impressive. Yes, it looked a little bit shaky at times, and because we've never seen these animals like in real life and in documentaries, like I don't think I've seen David Attenborough talking about whatever those were, those demons. And so they did kind of feel like aliens from Star Wars, but still the CG itself looked pretty smooth. And again, I was watching this on IMAX, so even though it looked a little bit shaky on IMAX, I mean, by the time you get to a regular cinema or even to your laptop screen, it's gonna look pretty legit. Then of course you had the most impressive sequence, which was the water sequence in the Colosseum. Apparently this is somewhat historically accurate. Those Romans were literally insane. Literally insane, but I love that. I didn't even clock, like, during the training sequence, that that's what they were training for. I was like, are they going to battle? Are they going to war at sea? What's going on here? But they had the rowing machines where they were practicing, and I completely forgot that I had seen this clip from the trailer, so I was pleasantly surprised when the stakes were increased in the Roman arena. And that's pretty much what this film aimed to do, is kind of raise the stakes when it came to the action sequences in particular. And that's something that I could really see, having watched the first Gladiator movie recently as well, because the first one, first of all, had real animals. Notably had real animals, which I think is a little bit tougher to do these days for ethical reasons, but also because, you know, you've already seen a tiger in the ring, so you kind of have to up the stakes a little bit, up the ante. So that was a difference. But second of all, it felt smaller, and the choreography was slower and a little bit sloppier, perhaps more realistic in the first movie, whereas this time around you have kind of superhero levels of fight choreography taking place. And I think that is a side effect or an impact of 20 years of blockbuster filmmaking, especially the prevalence of the MCU, kind of affecting this sequel and how it dealt with those action sequences, because you can definitely see a difference between the first one from 2000 to this one 24 years later. It definitely had more of a punch and it felt like it was more structured like an MCU movie, which I take as a positive because it kept the momentum going. There wasn't a slow moment, but perhaps it was a little bit too pacey, especially in the second half. We'll get to that in the negatives. But yeah, even though I did enjoy this movie quite a bit, there were a few critiques that I had here and there, especially after seeing the first one. Before I saw the first one, my main critique was that the second half is far pacier, far more rushed than the first half is. Considering how many different, interesting storylines and character arcs they were trying to handle with these characters, it seemed like they had a lot to resolve in the second half, and they just tried to kind of tie it up in a neat bow, and it felt a little bit rushed. And the most glaring issue for me was Lucius's relationship with Denzel Washington, Connie Nielsen, and Pedro Pascal, which all kind of seemed jumbled up by the end of the movie. I completely understood the change in his relationship with his mother because he had that kind of epiphany visiting Maximus's grave and kind of reconnecting himself with his true past. So that was all well and good. But I do think it was odd how quickly he forgave Pedro Pascal's Acacius, who, let's not forget, had his wife killed. Like, he's the reason why his wife is dead. And so when Lucius is like, oh, I'm gonna wear my grandfather's ring right next to my wife's one, but at the same time I'm going to forgive Acacius, I'm like, oh, something's not adding up here. There's quite a leap in logic when it comes to that change in character. But then we flip over to Denzel, and it seemed like Lucius and Denzel, sorry, I can't remember Denzel's name in this film, there's too many us's here. It seemed like they were kind of getting along. They weren't besties, but they had an understanding that there were, mutually beneficial elements to their relationship. So even though Lucius was like a slave or whatever, he was still able to fight for his freedom. And most importantly, Denzel had promised him Pedro Pascal's head if he was able to, succeed in the ring. And so he became a very successful and popular gladiator. He held up his end of the bargain, and so did Denzel, until Lucius had a change of heart and decided not to kill Acacius. And again, I feel like that was a little bit out of character for Lucius. They didn't quite take enough time to show why Lucius had changed his mind on Acacius specifically, but also they didn't take enough time to show why Lucius and Denzel's relationship changed so drastically. At first they were seemingly working together, kind of, but then suddenly they became mortal enemies. But yeah, second half of this movie was super rushed, and that was my main critique coming out of the cinema. But then I rewatched the original film, and I had more thoughts. Yeah, this movie, it's kind of a Force Awakens situation. This movie is kind of the Force Awakens in the sense that, like, you watch it and you're like, yeah, that was actually a really fun time. That was great. Loved it. But then you rewatch A New Hope and you're like, oh, you're like, oh, I see what it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of the same thing. Oh, it's a Force Awakens situation. Yeah, it's very similar to the first Gladiator. There are mirror characters in the sequel, or at least characters that mirror elements of characters that appear in the first one, which is why I think they went down a different route with Denzel's slave master character, because instead of him being an ally to Lucius the way that the slave master character was to Maximus in the first movie, in the sequel he becomes Lucius's enemy. me. So I feel like that's how they differentiated the two very similar characters. But yeah, if you hold up a mirror between these two films, you'll see quite a bit of overlap, and that was a pretty disappointing revelation, and it does hamper my enjoyment of the film a little bit in retrospect. But I still had a banger of a time, not gonna lie. I still had a banger of a time with the second Gladiator movie, even if it's not the most original thing. And this cinema going experience was still one of the highlights of 2024 for me. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Gladiator 2 an 8 out of 10. So that's it from me, guys. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Gladiator 2, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this movie down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!